quickly. Settle down.
Hi, I'm General Merrill A. McPeak, Tony McPeak. I've been a civilian now for some years, but for a long time I was a fighter pilot and became the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. Tonight you're going to see something about Desert Storm. I was in Washington in the Pentagon as one of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during Desert Storm. So unhappily was trapped behind a desk and didn't get a chance to participate in the actual air combat out there. But it was a revelation for most people how complete and rapid our victory was in Desert Storm. And I think it was obvious to everybody that our use of air power there was the key to our quick and relatively easy victory. We learned a lot. We learned that stealth was very valuable, and we've built nothing but stealth combat aircraft since, really. We learned that precision-guided munitions were the way to go, that bomb tonnage in itself was much less important than the actual fact of hitting what you aimed at. So there were other lessons, but those were two big ones, and they have shaped the development of the Air Force and the other services in the years since then. I hope you enjoy it. Good luck. Good flying.
The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in August 1990 was the culmination of a long dispute between two neighboring and very different Arab states. Both were oil producers, but Iraq was a brutal dictatorship fielding the fourth largest army in the world, while Kuwait was a more benign totalitarian state whose native population was outnumbered by guest workers drawn from all over the Arab and Muslim world. After the conclusion of his war with Iran, Saddam Hussein turned his attention towards Kuwait. Kuwait had heavily funded the 8-year-long Iraqi war against Iran. By the time the war ended, Iraq was not in a financial position to repay the $14 billion it borrowed from Kuwait. Iraq argued that the debt should be forgiven since the war had prevented the rise of Iranian Islamic fundamentalism in the Arab world. Kuwait's reluctance to pardon the debt created strains in the relationship between the two Arab countries. According to George Perot, the FBI interrogator who questioned Saddam Hussein after his capture in 2003, Iraq tried repaying its debts by raising the prices of oil through OPEC's oil production cuts. However, Kuwait prevented a global increase in petroleum prices by increasing its own petroleum production, thus lowering the price and preventing recovery of the war-crippled Iraqi economy. This was seen by many in Iraq as an act of aggression, further distancing the countries. Though Kuwait's large oil reserves were widely considered to be the main reason behind the Iraqi invasion, the Iraqi government justified its invasion by claiming that Kuwait was a natural part of Iraq, carved off due to British imperialism. After signing the Anglo-Ottoman Convention of 1913, the United Kingdom split Kuwait from the Ottoman territories into a separate sheikhdom. Saddam's government argued that Kuwait was legally and historically a province of Iraq. In July 1990, Iraq began massing troops on the Kuwaiti border. April Glaspie, the American ambassador to Iraq, in a meeting 2 weeks before the invasion of Kuwait, informed Saddam Hussein that the USA had no interest in the internal affairs of the Gulf region. Saddam took this to mean that there would be no opposition to his annexation of Kuwait.
If the United States had clearly signaled it would be wrong to attack Kuwait, and under the United Nations Charter, it's illegal for any state to challenge the territorial integrity of another, and the United States is obliged under the United Nations Charter and as a member state of the Security Council to, help to assure the defense of those states, who knows, that might have had the opposite effect of restraining Saddam Hussein. So I think it might be too strong to say it encouraged him, but it might be fair to think about the counterfactual of what would have happened had the U.S. said something completely different.
On August 2, 1990, overwhelming Iraqi forces overran Kuwait. In a single stroke, Saddam Hussein seized control of the world's second-largest oil reserves and threatened the world's largest, those just over the border in Saudi Arabia. His troops seized anything valuable and shipped their ill-gotten gains back to Baghdad.
There was some fear that the next stop might be Saudi Arabia, which would be a much bigger player. I mean, Saudi Arabia is the dominant state within OPEC because it produces an enormous percentage of the world's oil, and more importantly, it is the reservoir of much of the world's oil reserves. And so no one wanted to see, that oil threatened in that way. Oil markets, like any other markets, appreciate stability, and so Saddam was bringing disorder. And so even if he was merely threatening Saudi Arabia and questioning the supply of oil, then that potentially could lead, and did lead for a short time anyway, to increase in oil prices.
What was really at issue for the U.S. was, and this kind of goes back to the Carter doctrine, of having somebody who is not controllable in charge of so much of the world's oil. Because being positioned in Kuwait, the next target logically would be Saudi Arabia. And so that would give Saddam Hussein control over about 40% of the world's reserves. And that was just too much to tolerate.
The world waited to see what Saddam would do next. Led by the United States, an alliance began to form in response to the Iraqi threat to vital world oil reserves.
The lingering phrase from that building of the coalition was this phrase, Operation Tin Cup. You've probably seen images from film, right, where somebody's turning a grinder and there's maybe a monkey or a person holding a tin cup out to have the money go in. That was what the unofficial name was for Secretary of State James Baker going around the world convincing other states that it was the right thing to do to stop Saddam Hussein then and to help finance that operation. The Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Germans, and the Japanese, just those four states financed, I think, about 2/3 of the first Persian Gulf War. And then other states made contributions as well. So there was an enormous commitment by the U.S. of military force and troops, but there was a genuine coalition of nearly 30 states with troops in the area and lots of money coming in from various places.
Saddam invaded Kuwait in early August of 1990, and the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, they took the next, 5-6 months to work with the Allies. It was considerably different than what George W. Bush did when he invaded Iraq in 2003. So it was, I think, a fairly skillful diplomacy on the U.S. part, and a different notion than what we saw later, too, a notion simply of building a multilateral coalition, getting the Saudis to fund a good part of it.
Large American air and naval forces, together with elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, were deployed to the Gulf in an operation called Desert Shield, with the intent of defending the Saudi oil fields.
Today, as president, I ask for your support in a decision I've made to stand up for what's right and condemn what's wrong, all in the cause of peace. At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia.
First into the breach, in a powerful display of strategic mobility of air power, were 48 F-15CD Eagles of the U.S. Air Force's 1st Tactical. They were deployed from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia on August 7th, less than a day after King Fahd of Saudi Arabia requested assistance. The Eagles flew armed and were ready to fight their way into the theater of operation on the possibility that Saddam had not stopped in Kuwait. Landing in Dhahran, the Eagle drivers looked around and were relieved to see the airfield still in friendly hands. The flight was on patrol over the Kuwaiti border 17 hours after taking off from Langley. The situation in the region was bleak. 9 of Saddam Hussein's elite Republican Guard units stood at the Kuwaiti border, ready to drive south into the Saudi oil fields. It quickly became apparent that the F-15Es were the only force that could delay or harass such an advance. The price they might have to pay in the process was unthinkable. By August 11th, there were 12 F-15Es on alert at any given time. These were armed with Mk-20 Iraqi area munitions that released hundreds of golf ball-sized bomblets over an area as large as a football field, and were therefore highly effective in destroying lightly armored troop formations. 2 aircraft stood ready to defend the base or a strike package from enemy attack. They were loaded with AIM-9 Sidewinder and AIM-7 Sparrow air-to-air missiles. Luckily, during those first critical days, the feared Iraqi Republican Guard units and Iraqi Air Force never moved south. The reason for this was simple enough. Saudi Arabia was beyond Saddam's grasp simply because of the limiting logistical factors inherent to his forces. This would also prove to be a critical factor in Iraq's ability to hold on to what it had seized. In the air, the coalition's opponents were the men and machines of the Iraqi Air Force. By the summer of 1990, the IRAF constituted the 6th largest air force in the world. The IRAF air threat was significant, mainly because the Air Force was a source of pride to Saddam, and he had therefore seen to it that it was powerfully equipped. It comprised a mixed array of aircraft capable of fighting for air supremacy, repelling ground-based assaults, and attacking strategic targets. The IRAF had 8 squadrons of French-built Mirage FIEQs, equipped with modern air-to-air missiles. For attacking coalition troops, 10 IRAF air brigades were equipped with variable geometry MiG-23 BNs and Su-2022s, plus Hawker Hunters. 3 Tu-22 squadrons, a Tu-16H-6D squadron, and 2 Su-24 squadrons completed the air-to-ground contingent. The Su-24 was comparable to the F-111 and had the capability to mount devastating attacks against ground and sea targets. But the biggest threat to coalition aircraft came from 5 brigades of MiG-21, MiG-23, and MiG-25 fighters, and the highly regarded MiG-29. The MiG-25s were operated as part of a composite interceptor reconnaissance wing. These planes could fly higher and faster than the F-15 and posed a considerable threat, especially to high-value asset aircraft such as the E-2 Hawkeye and E-3 Sentry AWACS and air refueling tankers operating close to the Iraqi border. Much feared in the run-up to war, the IRAF's MiG-29 posed only a limited beyond-visual range threat to opposing aircraft. While it could employ the semi-active radar-homing AA-10 medium-range missile, its radar was not optimized for a long-range fight, and it had poor look-down, shoot-down capability. Once into the dogfight, however, the tables could turn. The MiG-29 was highly maneuverable and could fire its short-range missiles off-bore sight with the aid of a helmet-mounted monocle sight. They also featured a passive infrared search and track sensor with which to stealthily pick out targets without tipping off their electronic radar warning equipment. As the F-15CDs began their defense of the oil fields, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower entered the Red Sea. This was the first element of the most powerful carrier force ever deployed. By the time war broke out, it would include 6 carrier air wings. B-52 bombers were also deployed to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, and air forces from other nations began to arrive in the region. These included a squadron of air defense Tornadoes from Britain's Royal Air Force, deployed alongside similar Saudi machines, a Jaguar squadron in Oman, and the initial elements of France's Rapid Reaction Force. By the end of August, large numbers of U.S. Marine FA-18 Hornets and AV-8B Harriers were in theater, and for the first time, the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter was openly committed to the battle. The first 22 arrived on August 21st. In November, U.S. President George H.W. Bush decided to double the size of American forces deployed to the Gulf. The U.S.-led anti-Saddam coalition now had more than enough power to defend Saudi Arabia from any threat. Putting U.S. forces there was a risk. The U.S. did not have the supplies or support crews to fight effectively if pressed. While the president and his advisors bluffed about the power on the ground and the efficiency of the deployment, in reality, chaos reigned. The Middle East fell under the jurisdiction of the United States Central Command. Commander-in-Chief of CENTCOM was General H. Norman Schwarzkopf. Orders issued from Central Command were lost, ignored, or countermanded by someone down the line who thought they had a better idea. Cargo planes were filled with the wrong equipment. Commercial airlines landed at empty airfields while soldiers stood waiting for planes that never arrived. Schwarzkopf cut through the confusion with a simple list of priorities. He wanted fighting men and tank-killing aircraft. With the AH-64 Apache helicopter and the A-10 Thunderbolt in theater, Saddam's offensive options would narrow considerably. Schwarzkopf's choice of the A-10 ruffled Air Force feathers. The A-10 was an aircraft that might well have been destined for the scrap heap had Iraq not invaded Kuwait. The Air Force openly scorned the aircraft, which is ugly and asymmetrical. Pilots called it Warthog rather than Thunderbolt. The real problem, however, is that the A-10 specializes in a mission that the Air Force would prefer not to have: close air support. As hostilities broke out in the Gulf, the Air Force was planning to mothball the entire A-10 fleet. But Schwarzkopf, concerned about the troops on the ground, needed a tank killer. Air Force appropriation priorities did not matter. The AH-64, on the other hand, is something of a pampered platform. As the Army's premier combat aircraft, it's the most coveted assignment amongst helicopter pilots. The Apache is highly maneuverable, equipped with sophisticated navigation and targeting gear, and sports a deadly array of weapons. Apaches were a prime choice for another reason. They can be packed a half dozen at a time into a C-5 cargo plane. By the end of August, the airlift was in full swing, with a plane touching down every 22 minutes. Pilots began to talk about an aluminum bridge between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. The scales finally began to shift in favor of the coalition. In fact, the coalition was now strong enough to undertake the liberation of Kuwait. A United Nations resolution gave Saddam Hussein until January 15th to get out of Kuwait. If he failed to do so, the coalition was authorized to go to war. During World War II, the Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, discovered an essential truth about desert war. Whoever controls the skies controls the movement of troops on the ground. Saddam Hussein was about to discover the same essential truth. In August, immediately after Iraq invaded Kuwait, Air Force General Chuck Horner sat down with a yellow pad and a pencil. In a few hours, he outlined what would become the most effective air campaign in history.
First thing we had to do was seize control of the air. That was fundamental to everything we did. Then we had the obligation to take out his nuclear, biological, and chemical capabilities, isolate the central leadership of the country from the forces in the field, isolate those forces in the field by knocking down bridges and their ability both to resupply the battlefield and flee from the battlefield. And then finally, we needed to take out those systems that could inflict casualties on our friendly ground forces, armor and artillery.
The plan would be fleshed out and finalized by air planners in Riyadh, but the basics in Horner's outline did not change.
I said that it wasn't going to be that tough, you know. And I had a lot of details to go with that, but afterwards, the president drew Brent Scowcroft aside. Now, Scowcroft was a retired Air Force lieutenant general. Okay, so he, and a fighter pilot, by the way, flew F-86s. And of course, he was close to the senior Bush, and Bush to him says, "This McPeak guy, does he know what he's talking about?" Because I said, you know, we had planned the air phase. I say we. Chuck Horner, and the guys actually out in the theater had done this, had planned the air phase, and we thought it would last about, the whole war would last about a month. You know, we had phased it, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And We were wrong. It lasted 43 days.
As dawn broke on January 15, 1991, Saddam had until midnight to pull his forces out of Kuwait. No one expected him to move. The world held its breath and waited. Far from withdrawing, the Iraqis moved massive reinforcements into Kuwait and dug a formidable series of fortifications all along the Kuwaiti-Saudi border. Media pundits talked knowledgeably about the Iraqi berms or sand walls, backed by anti-tank ditches and minefields. These were supported by entrenched troops and dug-in armor and artillery. Making a frontal assault would be ruinously expensive for the coalition troops. But the war did not start on the ground. The extensive Iraqi fortifications did them no good at all. On the night of January 16th, 17th, the skies of Baghdad lit up as Iraqi gunners blasted at targets they could not see. Explosions ripped through the night as American F-117A stealth fighters and BGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missiles hit with pinpoint accuracy Iraqi command and communications targets, beginning the process of cutting Saddam Hussein off from his armies. Operation Desert Shield had now become Operation Desert Storm. Tomahawk cruise missiles are essentially pilotless aircraft equipped with 1,000-pound warheads. Despite their high profile, the effectiveness of cruise missiles in the Gulf War has never been publicly established. The Department of Defense released thousands of pages of statistics about virtually every aspect of the war in the Persian Gulf. Yet about the cruise missiles, the Pentagon remained oddly silent. In its final report to Congress, the Department of Defense would say only that cruise missiles had a launch success rate of 98%. What percentage of Tomahawks hit and destroyed their targets remains classified. But there are clues that seem to indicate that cruise missiles weren't as effective as the public believes. The General Accounting Office cited one post-war analysis that suggests that half the missiles never reached their intended targets. According to two different reports, cruise missiles that struck the Iraqi Air Defense Operations Center in Baghdad left only small craters in its roof. That's why 3/4 of all the missiles used in the Gulf were launched in the first 3 days of the war, and none were fired after February 1st. Even with shortened operations, the U.S. fired more than $380 million worth of cruise missiles at Iraq. At 2:30 a.m. Saudi time, 10 stealth fighters slipped out of Saudi airspace into Iraq. Silently, their computerized navigation systems guided them through the half-hour flight to downtown Baghdad. Flying undetected over the city, a slight press of buttons on pilots' control sticks delivered laser-guided bombs to crucial targets such as early warning radar control centers, radio towers that formed the nucleus of Saddam's communications network, and the air defense headquarters. In a matter of minutes, the heart of Saddam's air defense was cut out. Stealth pilots skirted through a lethal barrage of anti-aircraft artillery from below, but they kept their bombs on target. In only 15 minutes, they guided their invisible planes above the flak and then headed for home. The opening round had gone precisely as planned.
It was definitely more exciting than I'd anticipated. They shot more bullets than I thought were ever made. It was an experience that you almost have to go through to explain. And when the shooting started, when the word came that it was time to go and do what we do best, I thought we were very well prepared, very well trained, very well practiced, and you just had to revert back to your old habit patterns, pretend the threats weren't there, and just do the job that had to be done.
The F-117 stealth fighter was developed secretly during the Carter administration. It was able to move through Iraqi airspace virtually undetected. In Baghdad, Iraqi air defense didn't know they were under attack until the first bomb landed.
Desert Storm was the first, what I would call the first modern war, and what the Army might call the last ancient war, the last war of the industrial age. It was an industrial war. That's probably a better formulation. And I thought of it as the first war of the space age.
The Black Jet showed phenomenal accuracy, delivering 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs through doorways and down ventilation holes to destroy underground bunkers. By doing so, they were gaining the upper hand in the air over the battlefield. From the outset, Central Command realized that air superiority would be essential to victory in the desert. To reach this goal, air planners formed strike packages, teams of aircraft, each with a specific role to play on a given mission. Sometimes numbering over 50 planes, strike packages have the same basic components. First are air-to-air fighters, next the Wild Weasels, whose job is to locate and knock out SAMs. These are followed by radar jammers. Behind the jammers come the strike aircraft, the punch of the packages. Bringing up the rear is another flight each of Wild Weasels and air-to-air fighters. With as much as 5 miles between each group, a single strike package covers a huge piece of sky. Persian Gulf pilots describe them as 40-mile-long gorillas. In the battle against the Iraqi Air Force, the undisputed king of the hill was the F-15C. Capable of speeds in excess of 1,500 miles an hour and carrying both infrared and radar-guided air-to-air missiles, F-15s are fast and deadly. They're also heavy, weighing upwards of 60,000 pounds when fully loaded. In close-quarters dogfight, the F-15's weight would be a huge disadvantage. Fortunately, modern air-to-air warfare is seldom a close-quarters game. AIM-7 radar-guided missiles, one of the F-15's primary weapons, can destroy targets from 25 miles away. As the premier air-to-air fighters of Desert Storm, the F-15 did more to crush the Iraqi Air Force than any other coalition aircraft. Of 38 air-to-air kills, F-15s were responsible for 33.
We're flying the F-15Es, and essentially our mission here with the 4th Wing is to provide deep interdiction support for the ground forces. The primary targets are in the northern part of the theater, the northern Kuwaiti theater, and essentially the interdiction portion of it is to prevent those forces from being brought to bear against the forward deployed elements of the Army and the Marines, the coalition forces.
By the 10th day of Operation Desert Storm, what remained of the Iraqi Air Force had begun fleeing across the border and into Iran. Following the F-15s in strike packages were F-4Gs. Their mission, seek out and destroy any enemy installation or weapon system that uses radar. Their preferred weapon is the appropriately named HARM, or High-Speed Anti-Radiation Missile. HARMs lock onto the radar signal and simply follow it to the source. In Operation Desert Storm, the F-4G Wild Weasels were so effective that most Iraqi SAM sites simply refused to turn on their radar. As a result, radar-guided SAMs, which figured to be the biggest threat in the Iraqi air defense arsenal, accounted for only 20% of coalition casualties. The main strike force was usually comprised of F-16 Fighting Falcons. Designed as a low-level attacker, F-16s flew over 13,000 combat sorties and dropped more than 20,000 tons of bombs. However, they were not as effective as the Air Force had expected.
VMFA 314 is an F-18 Hornet squadron that is presently providing close air support and deep strike support, along with anti-air warfare for both Imminent Thunder and the Persian Gulf Desert Shield operation in general.
The reasons for the disappointing performance are easy to pinpoint. First, there was a critical shortage of the targeting pods needed to use guided munitions. As a result, none of the F-16s that flew in the Gulf used laser-guided bombs. While the Weasels had effectively neutralized the Iraqi SAMs, there was little that could be done to knock out the low-tech mobile anti-aircraft artillery. The Iraqis successfully forced the F-16s to altitudes above 12,000 feet. Finally, there was Mother Nature. The F-16 was designed as a clear-weather daytime aircraft. The entire 43 days of the air war were marked by low cloud ceilings and poor visibility. The F-16 barely had a chance to show its stuff.
But the weather was a factor. We never thought it was going to be as bad. I mean, we lost a lot of sorties over there because the weather was the worst in a decade or something like that. And this was fought in January and February, so these were winter months. And so many of our sorties aborted in the air because they never found the target, couldn't get to the target.
British and Saudi Tornadoes used their JP-233 runway denial munitions against runways and taxiways. British losses were relatively high due to their low-level tactics. Starting from the first night of the war, raids were repeated every night for weeks. The effect was obvious. In spite of a sortie rate of more than 2,000 missions per day, coalition air losses were under 0.1%. The FA-18 pilot flies one of the most versatile weapons in the military. His plane can fight in the air and attack on the ground. He can defend himself and the fleet against a multitude of threats, and he can perform all these tasks in a single mission.
A fighter pilot's brain is a certain size. When he's standing here on the ground and we're just talking, you put a strap on an airplane, it shrinks down to about 50% of that. It's dark outside and a lot of things are going on. You're operating on maybe 10% of what you have. So we call it STEM power. So when you're on STEM power, you really want to be able to fall back on those things that you've always done. So it's the habit patterns that are going to keep you alive.
For an attack mission, you're going to fly some kind of ingress. It might be low level, it might be high level. And as you're coming in, you're thinking about the target that you're going to attack, and you're also looking for other enemy airplanes on your radar. And if you find some, what you want to do is try to shoot those guys down before they engage you, obviously, because that's better for you. You'll be alive, and also you'll accomplish your mission. If they engage your strike package, more than likely you'll have to jettison all the air-to-ground ordnance you have and maneuver with them till you can either get away from them or shoot their airplanes down. Your mission won't go. So you're trying to work on that, and then as you get in closer to the target, you're going to switch modes. You switch from your air-to-air mode to your air-to-ground mode, and you start looking to acquire the target visually with the, you use the systems on board the airplane to aid you, and then as you get closer, you acquire it visually, and then you actually roll in on the target from high altitude and then release your ordnance. Sometimes you get overloaded. And then you have to kind of let some of the tasks go away. You just don't do them.
Training isn't always enough for a supersonic jet pilot to survive combat.
I still get scared, real scared, and you get kind of a little bit on edge, but that's pretty good though. Gives you that little burst of adrenaline there that keeps you on edge and doesn't allow you to become complacent.
The coalition allies were superior to the Iraqis in numbers, control, quality, and training. Thanks to the sophisticated long-range radar and advanced command and control capabilities of the Boeing E-3 AWACS, coalition pilots knew exactly what was going on in the skies over the war zone. When Iraqi pilots tried to make a fight of it, they were knocked out of the sky, primarily by the F-15 Eagles of the U.S. Air Force. At least 130 U.S. Air Force Eagles participated in the Gulf War, together with 4 Saudi squadrons. Eagles scored 35 out of a total of 41 coalition aerial victories in the Gulf, including the only 2 non-American kills by an Eagle of the Royal Saudi Air Force's No. 13 Squadron. The result of all the attention by coalition assets, both on the ground and in the air, meant that the Iraqi Air Force played very little part in the battle, and a large portion of its most modern aircraft was flown to internment in Iran to escape destruction. The commander of coalition forces, General Norman Schwarzkopf, called it preparing the battlefield. He knew that neither intense diplomatic efforts nor the condemnations of the United Nations were likely to persuade Iraq to leave Kuwait. The problem would be decided by military action and by battle on the ground. For his ground offensive to work, the opposing Iraqi land forces had to be hit hard from the air. The Iraqis possessed the 4th largest army in the world. They were well equipped and dug in. They needed to be softened up. This is where air power was brought into play with devastating effect. From the start of the shooting in January 1991, Iraq's ground forces were subject to incessant attack. By the end of the month, as the interdiction campaign progressively smashed Iraq's air power, command and control networks, more and more coalition air assets were free to be turned against Iraq's troops, artillery positions, supply centers, and lines of communications, destroying their effectiveness for the land battle to come. Giant B-52 bombers unloaded thousands of tons of explosives on Iraq's best troops, the Republican Guard, which was being held back as a mobile reserve.
The EW called out the possibility of a threat. The Iraqis had gotten pretty smart and they did not turn their radars on for any length of time. We had an explosion on the left side of the aircraft that we could tell was aft. It caused the aircraft to roll in about 10 or 15 degrees of bank. It was hard to tell because, like I said, we were in the process of doing S-turns the way it was. And when I looked out, I saw one go just off to my right side, just in front of the wing, and then a second one about, what I think, about 100 yards or so to the right of the aircraft. So the maneuvering and the jamming that the EW was doing probably saved, well, he did save us from taking at least 2 more, if not 3 more hits. I wasn't too concerned about the situation until I read the maintenance report of all the near misses and the possible damage that could have been done, and the over 65 holes that were in the airplane. When I saw that, then I wished I could have had a cold drink of some kind.
Clearly, the coalition ground offensive was coming, but without aerial reconnaissance, the Iraqis could not know when and where. The Iraqi forces could do little to interrupt the constant bombardment. Their battlefield air defense system had been reduced to limited numbers of missiles and obsolete gun systems. Although a small number of Allied aircraft were shot down or damaged, the devastation of Iraq's army was complete. When the coalition ground force moved, it moved fast. The assault burst upon the Iraqi army on March 24th. U.S. Marines, U.S. Army, Saudi, Kuwaiti, Egyptian, Syrian, and other Arab forces poured into Kuwait through engineer-blasted gaps in the Iraqi defenses. Far to the west, American airborne and air assault troops, in company with a French light armored division, were racing north through the Iraqi desert, heading for the Euphrates, with the aim of cutting off all Iraqi forces in the Kuwait theater of operations. In the center came the main punch. The U.S. Army's 7th Corps, a heavily armored 5-division force, including the British 1st Armored Division, drove along the Kuwait-Iraq border, outflanking the main defense lines and engaging the Republican Guard. Already demoralized by weeks of bombing, they gave themselves up by the thousands. Fixed-wing close air support was provided in the main by Air Force F-16s, A-10s, and Marine Corps AV-8Bs. The A-10's huge gun and powerful weapon load ripped through Iraqi artillery and armor with ease. 2 A-10s established a record at the end of the war by destroying 35 tanks in a day.
Well, the basic mission of the A-10 is close air support. Currently, until the ground war starts underway, we're doing a lot of AI missions and OCA missions targeting Scuds as well as EW sites, and we're actually doing some SAM site targeting.
It's back to the old stick and rudder flying. It's not an electric jet. It's got 2 hydraulic systems. The stick moves, the plane moves. You can feel it. You can feel the nuances in each jet. You still use the rudder in the plane when you're flying it, and it's more back to the old style flying.
The final impetus to surrender came when the close support aircraft brought the battle to a close by annihilating the massive Iraqi column fleeing from Kuwait along the Basra Road, which became known as the Highway of Death.
We try to be as professional in our job as the people in the Air Force are in theirs. But to tell you the truth, it helps my morale, I think, more than any lift we can give anybody else's morale, because to see people pulling together in such good spirit as we've seen out here today, I'm not afraid to use the word inspiring. It inspires me, I'll tell you.
In just under 100 hours, the 500,000-strong Iraqi force in Kuwait and southern Iraq was finished, and Kuwait was liberated. Under Operation Enduring Freedom, the U.S. fronted yet another post-Cold War coalition in the immediate aftermath of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The Combined Air Operations Center for OEF was based at MacDill Air Force Base, Florida. In October 2001, it generated an air tasking order that saw the beginning of a bombing campaign against Afghanistan in retaliation for the attacks on the United States. The B-2A Spirit earned a place in the record books for the longest non-stop combat mission ever, which lasted in excess of 40 hours. They carried weapon loads that included 2,000-pound Joint Direct Attack Munitions, or JDAMs. JDAM is a guidance kit that converts unguided bombs, or dumb bombs, into all-weather smart munitions. JDAM-equipped bombs are guided by an integrated inertial guidance system coupled to a global positioning systems receiver, giving them a published range of up to 15 nautical miles. With the transit time to Afghanistan from the Spirit's home base at Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri, being so long, the B-2s often took off without having a target assigned to them. As they approached Afghanistan, targets were passed to them via E-3 Sentry AWACS. Targets range from terrorist training facilities, the Taliban's few radars and airfields, to command and control facilities. The B-2 represents some of the most modern stealth technology in a manned operational aircraft. As the F-117 Nighthawk design bears the hallmarks of the 1970s technology, the smooth, clean lines of the B-2 are the products of the extremely powerful computers and software that were available a decade later. It is the aircraft's flying wing design itself that gives the B-2 its first level of radar avoidance and a reduced infrared signature. While the B-2 struck the most important Taliban targets early on, conventional forces formed the backbone of OEF. Iraq was one of the Bush administration's axis of evil states, but President George W. Bush's catalog of Iraqi transgressions was far more detailed and extensive than that of Iran and North Korea. In January of 2002, the United States had already achieved a significant victory over terrorism. Operation Enduring Freedom began on October 7, 2001, and scored a rapid defeat of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan and put the al-Qaeda terrorist organization on the run. With this apparent victory, the Bush administration was looking to defeat terrorists throughout the world. Iraq was next on the list. The Iraq of President Saddam Hussein was the model of a rogue nation, an outlaw state that attacked its neighbors and governed its people by fear. It fought an 8-year war with Iran in the 1980s, which ended in a stalemate after millions of deaths on both sides. It had invaded and occupied Kuwait in 1990, only to be defeated by a U.S.-led coalition. As part of the so-called global war on terror, and under the Bush doctrine, a new coalition was formed to invade Iraq and topple Saddam Hussein from power.
After the September 11th, 2001 attacks, there was some serious thinking in Washington about, what should the U.S. do sort of after Afghanistan about these lingering problems of terrorism and the potential that terrorism might be something much bigger than the problem of dog bites or bathtub falls, right? That the scale perhaps had changed. And the way that terrorism becomes a game-changing event is probably if it's linked to nation states that can provide it resources, financial support, technological support, etc. And particularly if those states, often at that time and through the 90s called rogue states, sort of outlaw states, that if they were pursuing weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and worst possible of all, nuclear weapons. So that if there was a nexus between these things, states that sponsor terrorism and states that are developing weapons of mass destruction, what happens if those things all come together and they decide to build these weapons and give them to the terrorists to use to basically advance their foreign policy without having to suffer necessarily the direct blame for that policy. And so that's what I think became the central idea driving what became the Bush Doctrine.
The Bush Doctrine warned rogue nations that the USA would not stand by and wait to be attacked.
The idea that the U.S. might preventively use force, although the language was usually preemptively, because for international law purposes, preemption has long been seen as legal, while prevention is much more dubious. But it essentially was a preventive policy to prevent these things long before they happen. Because by the time there's a smoking gun, or worse, a mushroom cloud, then it's too late, right? So you have to, you can't predict the activity of terrorists in the same way that you can predict, hopefully, the activity of nation states. But how do you prevent terrorists when you don't even know where they are? They could be hiding. So when you have that particular motive, trying to stop that particular strain of what George W. Bush called evil, if you have to try to constrain that form of evil in that particular guise, then that was the justification for the Bush doctrine, which could be targeted against their state sponsors.
On March 20th, 2003, 5:34 a.m. local time, the attack on Baghdad began. The images were hauntingly familiar. The Baghdad skyline, pale and ghostly in the greenish light of infrared night vision camera lenses, a pre-dawn sky blooming with explosions as American and United Kingdom cruise missiles and ordnance from coalition aircraft rained down on the ancient city just as they had done in January 1991. The long-standing proscription against assassination of enemy political leaders was officially ended by the initial strike, which was aimed at Saddam Hussein and his senior leaders. Although the strikes failed to get Saddam, it signaled a highly different way of conducting a strategic air campaign. Allied special forces had infiltrated Iraq long before the start of hostilities and mapped the most important strategic targets for the air war planners. They continued to provide targeting information throughout the aerial campaign, including a second direct attempt on Saddam. Later, FA-18 Hornets from the USS Constellation struck targets in the key southern city of Basra. Not far from there, just across Iraq's border with Kuwait, U.S. ground forces were massing. The 3rd Infantry Division, the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, and British Royal Marines were preparing to cross into Iraq and move on Basra. Their ultimate objective, and that of all the coalition military forces united for Operation Iraqi Freedom, was Baghdad and the end of Saddam Hussein. Just before dawn on the 20th, the U.S. 8th Fighter Squadron, once again led by 2 F-117s and supported by Navy EA-6B Prowlers, began their aerial assault, and the Navy ships launched their cruise missiles. Iraqi air defenses around Baghdad posed a much greater threat to the coalition's air components in 2003. Saddam had consolidated his integrated air defense system to form what became known as the Baghdad Super Missile Engagement Zone, or MEZ. The MEZ was shaped like the head of Mickey Mouse and was a dense array of surface-to-air missiles and AAAs. The F-117 would once again penetrate the MEZ to attack Baghdad, just as it had in January 1991. But taking out Iraqi IADS was now the task of the F-16CJ Wild Weasel, fitted with SAM-killing equipment. The bulk of the F-16CJ's first Iraq sorties were force protection, operating inside pre-assigned kill boxes into which strike aircraft were routed to attack fixed and mobile targets. Threats that came online within the boxes were struck or scared off air by the threat of a harm targeting system in flight. These missions were supplemented by sorties of 4 ship flights of F-16CJs, firing 2 harms each towards the locations of known threat emitters. Disappointingly for the SAM hunters, the Super MEZ stayed offline for the most part, and when it appeared that the Wild Weasels were meeting with almost no resistance, they turned their attention from suppressing the IADS to physically destroying it. The air war was very similar to Desert Storm. A key difference that this time the Iraqi Air Force remained on the ground with few exceptions. On the brink of the U.S.-led invasion, Saddam Hussein disregarded his Air Force's wishes to defend the country's airspace against coalition aircraft and ordered the bulk of his fighters disassembled or buried to keep them out of harm's way. There were also new technologies emerging that were making the job of ousting Iraq's dictator easier. The first was the RQ-1 Predator drone that had debuted in the Balkans in 1995, but which was now able to stream live footage into the cockpits of some of the strike fighters over the battlefield. If a Predator unmanned aerial vehicle located a target rather than simply talking the eyes of the pilot or weapons systems officer onto the ground, the Predator could now send images to show exactly what the target looked like. This was very useful against mobile targets when passing a set of fixed coordinates was ineffective. Perhaps the most interesting of concepts developed and matured over Iraq from 2003 to the end of combat operations in 2010 is that of network-centric warfare, where the strike aircraft and fighters are all linked to each other and AWACS and ground data links. The fighter data link, which allows the likes of the F-15s and F-16 to be sent target and threat data over the net, came into full use during Operation Iraqi Freedom. The ground war began on day one of the war, when coalition armor and infantry crossed into Iraq and headed for Basra and Baghdad. On the second day, the full force of coalition air power was brought to bear on command and communication targets within Baghdad. Over 700 aircraft dropped 3,000 precision-guided munitions that second day. Returning to base, aircraft were refueled and rearmed for the next mission. Some pilots did not want to stay on the ground for long, no matter what the condition was of their aircraft.
My buddy Steve Douglas is a pilot, and I'll probably get in trouble for telling this story on him, but he lands at the FARP, and I see him, and he's got like bullet holes, and stuff's not working, and every single one of those pilots, I swear, they were probably disobeying direct orders to get their butts back to Kuwait, to get something fixed or not, but those guys were staying in the air, and they were absolutely going to take it to the enemy forward and make sure the boys on the ground were covered come hell or high water. So I remember Steve being like, "You didn't see me here. If anybody asked, I wasn't here." Those kinds of things, seeing the pilots come down, and it's something as a mundane task as pumping gas and putting ordnance on. The Marines really understood the bigger picture, and I think it talking to the pilots that landed at our positions, they really got a full understanding of this stuff's really important, and this is no joke. And it may be the behind-the-scenes grunt work, the dirty work, but if we don't do it, people die. And so I think it gave them a new appreciation for it, and I love all the pilots. They were so great. They'd come back and be like, "This bomb, I'm going to go do this thing with it. That last thing you loaded, this is what I got." So it really motivated my guys, and I'll forever be grateful for that because it kept their heads in the game.
The ground advance was slowed on the 5th and 6th days of the war by sandstorms and stiff Iraqi resistance, but the lack of effective command and control meant that most of the Iraqi defenders could not put together a well-organized defense. Elements of the 3rd Infantry Division, 101st Airborne Division, and 1st Marine Expeditionary Force reached Baghdad's outskirts on April 3rd. The war to decapitate the Iraqi leadership recorded another success on the night of April 4th. Coalition aircraft struck the residence of Ali Hassan al-Majid, Saddam Hussein's cousin. Infamously known as Chemical Ali, he had ordered Iraqi forces to use chemical weapons on the Kurds in northern Iraq after the first Gulf War. He escaped and was later arrested by U.S. troops. In a demonstration of how quickly coalition assets were able to adjust to targets of opportunity, a U.S. Air Force B-1B bomber was diverted from a mission in western Iraq to attack a residence in Baghdad on the 19th day of the war. Following intelligence that Saddam's two sons may have been attending a meeting in the El Mansour section of Baghdad, the B-1 dropped JDAMs on the suspected meeting place. At least 3 buildings were destroyed, which left a huge smoking crater. The sons had been at the meeting, but left minutes before the attack. As the 3rd week of the war drew to a close, elements of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, mechanized, raced through the streets of Baghdad on the first of 2 thunder runs to test the defenses of the city. Coming in from the east, units of the 1st Marine Division linked up with the 3rd and established a holding position in the center of the city. The war was not over. The northern cities of Kirkuk, Mosul, and Tikrit remained in Iraqi army control. Tikrit fell on April 14th. It was the last major city in Iraqi control, and it was symbolically important as Saddam Hussein's hometown. It was reported to be defended by 2,500 hardcore Republican Guard troops. After intense bombing by coalition aircraft, the Iraqi troops abandoned their weapons, uniforms, and positions and fled the city in a full-scale rout. On May 1, 2003, President Bush sat in the starboard seat of an S-3B Viking when he landed aboard the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln off the coast of California. Later that day, he announced the end of major combat operations in Iraq.